Sotterley's significance is that it tells a lengthy story from covering 1699 through 1961, and it also tells a diverse story about the lives of not only the landowners, but those of the enslaved as well. James Bowles came here and purchased 2,000 acres in 1699. He wouldn't build the original manor house until 1703, but it was a working plantation from the get-go. Every owner has made their own contribution to the home's architecture. The original structure was a 2-room house done in a style called a hall and chamber. Everything is an addition onto or a renovation of that structure. So the room that we're in now was added on around 1715, also done by James Bowles. The platers would add on parts of the upstairs, the drawing room, and other parts of the home, including the dining room. One of the things about Sotterley, though, is that the modifications and restorations continue today. The room we're in now was restored in the early 2000s, and we'll be restoring other parts of the home, including the hallway. We're finishing up a restoration in the red room, which is the oldest room in the house, and we're going to be working throughout the winter for that. So the staircase banister was constructed in the late 1760s when George Plater III owned the home. It was designed in a style called Chinese Chippendale, and it was designed by a man named Richard Bolton, who had also constructed a similar banister in another manor house in the county in Bushwood. What's interesting about this is that he would have been assisted by skilled enslaved craftsmen, either that were here on site or that were rented from another plantation owner. It's built in sections, and it's all hand carved or hand created with very little hardware in it. So the red room is one of the more popular rooms of Sotterley. It's one that sticks with visitors when they come back years later. It tends to be considered to be the oldest room in the house. It is structurally the oldest, but the red paint was added on in the mid-20th century by the last owner, Mabel Satterley Ingalls. And for years we wondered why this shade of red. It turns out that her grandfather, J.P. Morgan, had a room in his home in New York City that was pretty close to this shade of red. We recently had this red paint restored, so this is a modern recreation of it, and we were able to do paint analysis using paint samples to determine the history of the paint here. And we'll be finishing up in this room with restoring the flooring in here. And we also did something in here called dendrochronology, which allows for us to determine the age of the wood paneling in here. And we were able to find out that the paneling was made somewhere between 1727 and 1732. So it's a kind of a interesting restoration project. Initially, people wanted to go back to 1703. We found out that that was a lot harder than we thought it would be. So we're going to keep it like it was in the 20th century. So part of what makes Sotterley interesting architecturally is the foundation upon which it was built. It was built using a system called a post and ground foundation, using primarily cedar and cypress logs. Some of the posts that we have date back to that 1703 period. Others were added on in the early part of the 1800s. So this post that you're seeing has been helping to hold the house up for a couple of centuries. In addition to the manor house, Sotterley has on the grounds a slave cabin built in the 1830s. This cabin would have been in use as a house of some sort all the way up through the early part of the 20th century. So one of the reasons why the people like James Bowles and the Plater family wanted a house on a hill overlooking the water was Sotterley was the site of a very active wharf. These families were investors, not just growing cash crops, but James Bowles was an investor in the Royal African Company, which was a slave trade company that directly transported captives from places like what is now Cape Coast, Ghana, to points throughout the Americas. Some of the enslaved on the slave ships that came here, like the Generous Jenny, some of the enslaved would be unloaded here, but others would be sent to auction sites in Virginia. The money from the auction would basically go back to James Bowles as a return on his investment. Last year, Sotterley was recognized as a UNESCO Site of Memory. UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. UNESCO had spent over 20 years doing something called the Slave Route Project, and sites of memory are sites that are directly connected to the history of the transatlantic slave trade. But to also qualify for this status, you not only had to have the history, but you also had to be putting forth the effort to educate the community, both, right in your neighborhood as well as far out as you can, about the history here and about the history of slavery and the slave trade. So we received that recognition last year, and we're very proud of it.
How was Sotterley affected in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812?
Well, during that time period, during both wars, the Plater family owned Sotterley, and they were on this side of the Patriots during the Revolution and on the side of the United States during the War of 1812, in a region that was heavily swayed and influenced by the British and loyal to the British. The British came here a total of 4 times between the 2 wars and helped about 60 enslaved people escape from here. For the Platers, that was kind of the beginning of their economic decline and their status, as much of those that ran away were domestic or skilled enslaved. Sotterley has, for the past several years, been working on what we call our Descendants Project. What we have is an obligation to tell the stories of all of those whose ancestors lived here or impacted by this place. Our descendants continue a legacy of involvement here, and we have over 200 people, various backgrounds connected here, and that helps Sotterley's story continue on. Having descendants on our board of trustees, including descendants of landowners and descendants of the enslaved, helps us to further our mission. You can go to www.sotterley.org and check us out there, or you can go on social media. We're on Facebook and on Instagram. Sotterley is open May through the end of October, Wednesdays through Sundays. We also have a variety of specialty tours, including our very popular ghost tours in October, and visitors are welcome to check us out then, and always stay tuned to see what we have on social media.